I remember those days before my wedding as honeyed and loud, laughter in every room, tissues in every purse, my mama pinning lace with shaky pride. The church ladies squeezed my hands at the market and said, "Baby, God done smiled on you." I smiled like a good bride, but a thin chill kept sliding under my ribs, a draft I couldn't seal. Maybe it was nerves. Every bride gets butterflies, right? Only mine felt metallic, clattering, asking questions I didn't want. I tried to hush them with playlists of love songs, hot tea, and long baths where I rehearsed walking down the aisle. Still, the chill returned, quiet and stubborn as a locked door that kept rattling. From the outside, Marcus was spotless. Tall, a suit that fit like a promise. I wanted to believe simple. Dress, ring, kiss, life. But love isn't simple when your spirit keeps tugging your sleeve. There were tiny cracks I nearly ignored. Marcus kept his phone face down, even at family dinners, and stepped outside to take a quick call, returning with a breeze on him. He'd ask about napkin colors and the playlist for our first dance, and I'd let myself float on those details like petals on water. The night before my bridal shower, I sat in the dark at my bedroom window and watched the streetlights paint yellow coins on the asphalt. Downstairs, my cousins were laughing around cupcakes, and Mama hummed to a gospel record worn thin with love. It should have been perfect. Instead, I pressed my palm flat to my chest to steady the rhythm inside it. Sometimes your body tells the truth before your mind can stand it. A jaw that won't unclench, a breath that sticks, a blink that lingers. Around midnight, Marcus came by with flowers that looked too expensive to be real. Everyone oohed. He beamed. His arm slipped around my waist like we were already a story with a happy ending. For a moment, I let his warmth drown out that rattling door. When the house finally exhaled into silence, I cleaned the entry like Mama taught me. Shoes on the rack, keys in the bowl, flowers in water. Marcus's suit jacket lay over a chair, heavy and careful. "Don't snoop," I told myself. "Trust is the backbone." Still, the jacket felt weighted with more than fabric. I lifted it and something thumped softly against my palm. An envelope, thick, unsealed. The hallway held its breath with me. I could have tucked it back and gone to bed, wrapped myself in ignorance like a blanket. Instead, with careful hands, I slid the paper free. A photograph. Marcus, too close to a woman I didn't know, his mouth at her ear, her palm on his chest, the kind of closeness that only exists when promises have already been made in secret. On the back, a date from 3 weeks ago. My breath went narrow. The flowers seemed loud with scent. I stared until the edges blurred, then blinked hard, willing the picture to change. It didn't. I slid it back into its paper skin, smoothed the jacket, hung it in the closet, and sat on the bottom stair with my hands tucked into my sleeves like a child who needed a smaller world. People say love is trust. They don't say what to do when trust turns into a question that won't stop growing. Do you ask, accuse, wait, watch? I didn't know. I only knew the clock in my chest was ticking louder, and for the first time I could hear each beat. That night I made an unglamorous promise. Pay attention. No scenes, no speeches. Listen, watch, gather what I needed to either fix this or leave with my head high. I tucked that promise beside the ache and climbed to bed as morning pressed a thin blue line against the blinds. And if you think that single picture was the worst of it, bless your tender heart. The truth waiting for me wouldn't just bruise a wedding. It would shake the stained glass windows and make the choir forget their next note. The morning after that discovery, I woke with my heart heavy. The photograph lay in my memory as sharp as glass, slicing every sweet thought about Marcus. I brushed my teeth in silence, stared at my reflection, and whispered, "Maybe it's nothing, maybe it's old." But lies leave a bitter taste. Mama bustled into the kitchen, humming and frying bacon like the world was still safe. She looked at me and said, "Child, you look pale. Nerves, huh? Weddings will do that." I nodded quickly, forcing a smile so she wouldn't look deeper. But when her back turned, my hand shook so bad I nearly dropped the orange juice. By midday, my cousins had arrived, arms full of decorations for the shower. Balloons squeaked against each other, ribbons trailed across the floor, and everybody kept saying how lucky I was. "Marcus is a good man," one of my African dark-skinned aunts repeated. I wanted to believe her, wanted their words to cover the truth like paint covers a crack. But the more they praised him, the louder that photograph shouted in my head. Later that afternoon, my best friend Tanisha pulled me aside. Tanisha, an African dark-skinned woman who reads faces like scripture, squinted and asked, "Girl, you okay? You look like you saw a ghost." I laughed, said it was stress. But Tanisha didn't buy it. Her eyes softened. Listen, she whispered. I ain't never liked the way Marcus ducks out or when folks ask about his past. Keep your eyes open. Her words struck me harder than she knew. I wanted to tell her about the photo, to unload the weight pressing my chest. But instead, I bit down on the confession and smiled. That night, the shower sparkled. There were games, jokes, and a gospel solo. I clapped, I danced, I wore my mask so well even I almost believed it. Almost. But every time Marcus's name came up, I felt the room tilt slightly, as if the floor beneath me knew something I hadn't spoken out loud. After the guests left, I sat among torn wrapping paper and half-eaten cake, the silence pressing closer. I replayed Tanisha's warning and Marcus's slipping out for a call. He'd returned smiling, holding a champagne bottle he claimed a coworker dropped off. I clapped for the gift, but inside, suspicion tapped harder. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and thought, what if I'm marrying a stranger? That idea, once whispered, wouldn't go back into silence. It echoed in my ears, steady and cruel. The photograph wasn't enough. I needed proof that couldn't be explained away, something undeniable. So I made another promise to myself. Watch him. No arguments, no scenes, just watch. Because deep down, I already knew this wasn't nerves, it was a warning. And soon, I learned just how dark that warning really was. The week rolled forward like a runaway cart. My dress hung on the closet door, ivory satin catching light as if it already knew the aisle. Mama moved through the house humming wedding songs. Yet beneath the music, a drum of doubt kept pounding, steady and mean, like a hand knocking from the wrong side of a door. Marcus got slicker. He kissed my cheek more, smiled broader, cracked jokes with the family as if auditioning for sainthood. To everyone else, he looked baptized in love. To me, his grin stretched too wide. Pain overwrought. Every time his shoulder brushed mine, the photograph whispered, what else is he hiding? Tanisha cut through my quiet like a whistle. We were folding ribbons when she leaned close, voice low, the kind that makes truth sit up. Sis, I gotta say this before you walk down that aisle. Something about Marcus don't sit right. I've seen men like him, charming, smooth, but slippery. You sure you know what you're signing up for? Her words landed on soil already cracked. I opened my mouth to defend him, to protect the fairy tale I'd been stitching, but the truth slipped out first. I told her about the envelope, the picture, the date on the back. She stared, eyes sharp as glass. You serious? And you still acting like nothing's wrong? She hissed. I shushed her, scared Mama might hear. Maybe it's old, I whispered, clinging to the softest lie. Maybe it's nothing. Pictures don't lie, baby, she said, squeezing my wrist. And if that's what you found by accident, imagine what's hidden where you ain't looked. Men don't hide what's holy. We fell quiet. The ribbon whispered through my fingers like a secret trying to speak. For the first time, I said it out loud, even if only to her. I don't know if I can trust him. The room held its breath. The kettle clicked off, and Mama started humming again. Tanisha's grip softened. Listen, she said, voice steady. If you find more, don't let fear lock your mouth. You got a whole congregation coming for those vows. If he's dirty, don't let him chain you with promises made in lies. I pictured myself in my gown, chin high, saying no in front of every eye. The image scared me, and thrilled me too. That night I couldn't quiet the house in my head. Memories knocked for light. The calls he took in the yard, the gift with no card, the way he changed the subject whenever someone asked where he'd been before us. I lay on my back and watched shadows climb the ceiling like doors I didn't want to open. Around 2 a.m, I walked the hall slow. The flowers he'd brought sat too proudly on the table, petals wide as open mouths. I touched a stem. Too many thorns for roses that pretty. In the quiet, I made a plan. No scenes, no screams. Watch, listen, gather what I needed to either mend this with truth or walk away with my head unbowed. Before dawn, I finally slept. When sunlight combed through the blinds, I woke with a new steadiness. Tired, yes, but braver than the night. I brewed coffee and let the bitter sit on my tongue until it gave its lesson. Bitterness comes from burning, and something in this love had burned past sweet. Tanisha texted, "You got me if you need me." I typed back, "I will." Then I wrote 2 lists, the man I love, the man I might be marrying. Under the first, he prayed with me when Mama was sick. He remembered my song. Under the second, face down phone, late night calls. A photograph with a date that didn't love me back. I stared at both lists and felt the drag of a choice. Love is a vow, yes, but it's also a mirror, and mine was starting to show me a woman who deserved better than maybe. I folded the paper, slid it into my Bible, and closed the cover. If all I had was a whisper, I'd follow it until it became a voice. And if it became a shout, I'd let the whole church hear it with me. I woke before the sun, my chest tight like I'd been sleeping under a stone. Wedding week had turned the house into a parade, ribbons on chairs. To anyone else, Marcus and I were sparkling. To me, we were a picture with a thin crack the light revealed. He moved through the rooms with a jitter I could taste. He checked his phone under the table, smiled too long at jokes that weren't funny, and vanished on errands that changed names, picking up ties, meeting a caterer, grabbing a gift. He came back carrying cologne that wasn't his, a sweetness that wasn't ours. I held my breath and told my face to behave. In front of Mama, he brushed my shoulder and asked about the playlist for our first dance. She snapped a photo us framed by paper flowers. I watched myself grin on her screen and felt the floor tilt, as if the picture were a window and I was falling through it. That evening, I stood at the sink, sleeves rolled, letting warm water run over spoons. Marcus slipped out the front door, said he'd be right back. From the upstairs window, I saw him on the sidewalk, head bent, laughing in a way I hadn't heard in months. Bright, young, unburdened. He turned the corner, still laughing. The sound hung in the trees like a ribbon. When he returned, he was tender the way guilty men study in mirrors. He poured me wine, rubbed my shoulders, asked about the florist. The kindness sat like a wrapped box that smelled faintly of smoke. I nodded and tasted the metal edge of patience. Night stretched across the ceiling. Beside me, Marcus slept hard, easy as someone whose secrets had taken their shoes off. I stared at the blinds and counted my breath the way a choir director counts beats. In, 2, 3, out, 2, 3. Trust sounded different now, like a door with a soft rattle you can't ignore. I wanted to shake him awake and ask, "Who are you when I'm not in the room?" But I didn't. Pride is quiet armor. I pulled the covers to my chin and kept the promise I'd made. No scenes, no shouting. Watch, listen, gather. If this love could be saved by truth, I'd meet it head on. If not, I would walk away with my name intact. By morning, I had a plan and a list. I wrote down the questions fear swallowed. Why the vanishings? Why the face-down phone? Who taught your laugh to change and where? I tucked the paper in my Bible, felt its weight settle like a coin in a pocket. Small but undeniable. At breakfast, Mama slid a plate to me, eyes shining. "Almost there, baby." I kissed her cheek and swallowed the ache. Across the table, Marcus scrolled and smiled at something behind glass. The little blue light lit his jaw like a stage. My heartbeat matched the flicker. Before noon, neighbors dropped off blessings, foil pans, prayers, advice I'd heard since girlhood. Choose peace, choose truth. The words clung to me like the scent of starch. I carried them room to room, practicing the courage to use them. When he left for another errand, I stood in the doorway and let the silence tell on him. In that hush, I heard every unasked question, felt every mile he'd put between us while pretending to stand close. Our wedding was days away, but the distance had already unpacked its suitcase. I am not a dramatic woman, not by nature. I iron napkins, I return cards, I count my blessings by name. But sometimes love requires courage you don't plan for. I straightened my spine, raised my chin, and listened to the quiet inside me, no longer a whisper. It was a voice now, steady and low. Pay attention, pay attention. And so I did. I watched the door, I watched the clock, I watched the way my hands stopped shaking when I believed myself. Whatever I found next, I would not be the one pretending. And if the truth proved bigger than my dress, I'd let it be bigger. The vows could wait, my dignity would not, ever. Tuesday moved like backstage. Bobby pins everywhere, Mama's gospel radio low, bridesmaids arguing curls. I should have floated. Instead, I walked like someone carrying a full glass. Across a shaking floor. Marcus paced with his phone. "Caterer, babe, give me 10. His smile never reached his eyes. He tossed his jacket on the couch and left for errands. I gathered ribbon scraps and tried to believe in ordinary, but curiosity is a stubborn guest. Respect can hold the door so long. Lifting the jacket to hang it, something knocked my palm and slid to the cushion, a leather notebook. Edges dark, spine tired, chatter thinned. I opened it. Pages crowded with quick, leaning handwriting. Dates, times, hotels, initials, notes like stage directions for a life I wasn't in. My fingers stopped at last Friday. A reservation 2 towns over. Another page held a woman's name half scribbled. I pressed my thumb to the ink. It did not blur. Upstairs, my cousins whooped. Mama called, "Baby, bring me the pins." I made my mouth obey. "Coming, Mama." The words came out thin. I slid the notebook back, smoothed the jacket, then smoothed my face in the mirror because a bride is supposed to look like certainty. Inside, I was a courthouse. Every glance filed as evidence, every memory called to the stand. Marcus returned with champagne and jokes. He kissed my forehead and promised my uncle he'd take care of her forever. I nodded beside him, counting beats between his laugh and the blue glow of his screen. Love had turned to math, and the totals came up short. That night, I carried my veil upstairs and laid it across my lap. I thought about the notebook, the photograph, and the way girls are taught to ignore pain to keep peace. "You cannot marry a man who carries another woman's name in his pocket," I whispered. The words landed like a stake. I wanted to confront him, but his lies were polished. They stacked like pretty boxes, empty inside. I needed proof that could stand under denial, so I made a vow to myself. No scenes, no screaming. Watch, listen, gather. If truth could save us, I'd meet it. If truth said go, I'd leave with my name unbent. Morning found me before the light. Coffee bit my tongue and taught its lesson. Bitterness comes from burning. I wrote what I knew. The hotel, the initials, the vanishings. I wrote what I deserved. Honesty, steady hands, real prayer. I folded the page and slid it into my Bible, the one Mama gave me at 16. That book had always held promises. Now it held proof. By noon, Tanisha knocked with bobby pins. She read my face like weather. "You good?" I tapped the jacket pocket. Her eyes sharpened, then softened with anger, not for me. "Say the word," she said. "If you need out, I'll bring the car to the church steps." I laughed a little, then didn't. It felt like the first safe breath I'd taken in days. Dusk, a text from Marcus. "Running late. Don't wait up." I set my phone face down the way he always did. Then I slid copies of my notes into an envelope and tucked it in my purse. Insurance against the next pretty story. At the window, I watched streetlights coin the pavement until the neighborhood fell quiet enough to hear the truth breathing. People say weddings are about joy. Sometimes they're about mercy. The mercy of seeing what is, not what you wish. I didn't know if I would light the match or step aside, but I knew this. I would not walk into God's house empty of courage. If the truth I carried weighed more than the dress on my shoulders, I would let it weigh what it weighed. And listener, if you think that notebook ended the story, bless your tender heart. Evidence doesn't close a door, it cracks it open. What waited beyond would make the choir miss its cue and the stained glass tremble, and teach a certain man the sound his secrets make when they're spoken where God can hear. The days before a wedding are supposed to feel like sunrise, bright, hopeful, filled with the hum of promise. But for me, each dawn carried the weight of something darker. My sleep grew shallow, my appetite thin, my smile stretched. The notebook haunted me. I replayed the entries in my head, counting the hours he had carved away for someone else. And yet, part of me still wanted to believe I was wrong, that love could rewrite facts written in ink. Marcus acted sweeter than ever. He brought roses, texted me good morning, good afternoon, good night, each message dripping with sugar. He joked with Mama, offered to run errands for the bridesmaids, even washed dishes after dinner like he was auditioning for Husband of the Year. To everyone else, he shined like gold. To me, he glittered like foil wrapped around stone. One evening, I followed my instincts. When Marcus said he needed to step out for a call, I slipped on my jacket and shadowed him from a distance. The night was damp, the street lamps buzzing. He walked quickly, voice low on his phone, laughter spilling too easy. My stomach knotted. I kept far enough not to be seen, close enough to hear fragments. "Yeah, baby, soon. Can't wait." The words sliced through me sharper than any blade. I ducked behind a parked car, breath shallow, heart drumming in my ears. He leaned against a wall, face lit by the glow of his screen, smiling the kind of smile he never gave me anymore. And then she appeared, a woman, tall, graceful, too familiar with him. He tucked his phone away and pulled her close. Their hug wasn't polite. It was long, full of promises that belonged to me but lived in her arms. My knees almost buckled. I clutched the car's cold metal, forcing myself not to cry out. Betrayal doesn't arrive with thunder. It slides in quiet like a thief until suddenly you realize the house of your heart has been emptied. I stayed hidden until he walked her inside the hotel lobby. Then I stumbled home, every step heavier, every breath sharper. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, veil box staring from the dresser. My hands trembled as I pressed them together, whispering a prayer half plea, half declaration. Lord, don't let me marry a lie. Tears finally broke, silent but hot, carving rivers down my cheeks. The evidence was no longer ink on paper. It was flesh, arms, laughter. It was undeniable. That night, the house around me slept peacefully. Only I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sight until my chest ached. Mama's dream of a perfect wedding, my cousin's excitement, the church filled with flowers, all of it built on rot. My heart broke, but beneath the breaking, something else rose. Clarity. I couldn't unknow what I knew. I couldn't unsee what I saw. By dawn, one truth stood taller than my pain. I had the power to decide. He might betray, he might lie, but the choice to stay silent or to speak, that belonged to me. And when the day came, my voice would not tremble. Listener, that was the night my fear cracked open and something fiercer stepped through. That night after the hotel, I crawled beneath my blankets, but sleep would not come. My body lay heavy, yet my mind spun like a wheel stuck in mud. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw him again. Marcus leaning close, his smile too free, his arms wrapped around a woman who wasn't me. The memory was bright as neon, impossible to dim. I turned on my side. The clock glowed past midnight, then 1, then 2. Every hour whispered the same truth. He is not who you thought he was. The silence in the room pressed so loud I could hear my own heartbeat echoing against the walls. I clutched a pillow and whispered, Why would you do this to me? My voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger. I tried to bargain with the darkness. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she was a colleague. Maybe the hug was nothing. But the notebook on the chair across the room disagreed. The photograph still burned in my memory. And my gut, the one that had warned me all along, kept shouting. I rolled onto my back and stared at the ceiling until the shadows began to look like doorways. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, and the ground beneath me was crumbling grain by grain. At 3 a.m., I sat up, unable to stay still. My hands trembled as I lit the lamp. I pulled out my journal and began to write. Not for proof this time, but for survival. Page after page, I spilled my confusion, my anger, my heartbreak. I wrote down every red flag I had ignored. The secretive calls, the vanishing acts, the way he always kept his phone face down. I wrote until the ink smudged and my tears dotted the paper. When the pen slipped from my fingers, I whispered a prayer. Not for Marcus, not for the wedding, but for me. Lord, give me strength, give me clarity, don't let me lose myself in his lies. My voice cracked, but the words steadied me. I realized the fight wasn't about saving the relationship, it was about saving myself. Around 4, Mama stirred in the next room, her soft humming carrying through the walls. She was dreaming about flowers and cake, about walking me down the aisle. My chest ached knowing she still believed in a fairy tale. I didn't want to break her heart, but I couldn't let mine be shattered in silence. I lay back down, eyes wide open, the pages of my journal cooling beside me. The house breathed slow, but my spirit felt awake, alive, almost electric. The fear that had once paralyzed me was shifting into something else. Resolve. If Marcus thought his secrets would stay buried, he didn't know the strength of a woman pushed to the edge. By dawn, I still hadn't slept. But I wasn't just a broken bride anymore. I was a woman sharpening, bracing for the storm to come. And though exhaustion weighed on my body, determination lit every corner of my soul. Listener, that sleepless night was the beginning of my transformation. Betrayal had cut me, but it had also carved out space for courage. And I promised myself, when the moment came, I would not whisper. I would roar. Morning arrived, but it did not feel like a blessing. It felt like a long, gray stretch of hours I had to push through with heavy shoulders. My eyes burned from a night without sleep. I painted concealer under them and forced a smile at Mama when she peeked into my room. "You ready for breakfast, baby?" she asked. I nodded quickly, pretending I didn't hear the worry in her tone. Downstairs, the table overflowed with food. Scrambled eggs, bacon, grits, biscuits, the whole spread. Mama had cooked like she was feeding a congregation. Her joy so radiant it nearly blinded me. I sat with my plate, but each bite tasted like sand. Marcus walked in late, whistling, kissing Mama's cheek like the perfect son-in-law. He slid into the seat across from me, his grin wide, his eyes sparkling. Anyone else would have believed him, but I knew the smile was camouflage, stretched tight over the rot I had seen with my own eyes. He asked about the cake, about flowers, about whether the bridesmaids' dresses fit right. I answered in clipped words, fighting the urge to reach across the table and shake him until the truth tumbled out. Instead, I studied every detail, his quick glances at his phone, the way he shifted whenever I mentioned schedules, the casual lies he slipped in as easy as butter on toast. The cracks were widening, and I could see daylight pouring through. Later that afternoon, while Mama napped on the couch, Marcus sat beside me on the porch. The air was heavy, cicadas humming, heat clinging like a blanket. He leaned back, stretched his arms, and said, "Can you believe it? Just a few days and you'll be my wife." His voice dripped with charm, but I heard something hollow beneath it. I wanted to scream, "How many wives do you plan on collecting?" But I kept silent, gripping the armrest until my knuckles turned pale. As the sun dipped low, Tanisha showed up. She brought a basket of supplies for the rehearsal dinner, but her real purpose was me. She caught me alone in the kitchen, eyes sharp. "Girl, you're fading. What's he done now?" My throat tightened. I handed her the coffee pot just to keep my hands busy. Quietly, I told her about the hotel, about the woman, about the embrace I had witnessed. Her jaw clenched, her breath sharp. "You can't marry him. Don't you dare tie yourself to a liar." Her certainty was a balm and a blade. A balm because someone else finally saw what I carried. A blade because hearing the truth out loud made it impossible to keep pretending. I wiped my eyes and whispered, "I don't know how to stop it. Everyone's waiting for the big day. Mama's so happy." Tanisha grabbed my hand. "Better to break hearts now than to break your spirit for the rest of your life." That night, Marcus slipped into my room after everyone was asleep. He wrapped his arms around me like nothing was wrong. His breath was steady, his touch rehearsed. I lay stiff in his embrace, staring at the ceiling. The veil box glowed faint in the moonlight from the dresser. My thoughts throbbed. Do not forget what you saw. Do not forget who he is. The cracks between us had grown too wide to cover. His lies sat between us like a wall. Every "I love you" he spoke sounded like a test I refused to fail. I stayed silent, but inside something fierce whispered, "The altar will not save him. It will expose him." And listener, in that moment, I stopped being the bride desperate to hold on. I became the woman preparing to set herself free. The morning after Marcus crept into my room and held me like nothing was broken, I woke with a heavy decision pressing against my chest. I could not carry the weight alone anymore. Secrets rot faster in silence, and I needed another voice to remind me I was not imagining things. So I decided to look for answers outside the house, from people who had no reason to lie for him. I started with Sister Janine, one of the churchwomen who had known Marcus since he was a boy. She always called me child, with a tenderness that made me feel like family. I visited her under the pretense of asking about hymns for the ceremony. She poured tea into china cups and studied me with her knowing eyes. "You got a question hiding on your tongue, baby," she said softly. My hand shook as I told her about the notebook, about the hotel, about the woman I had seen. She did not gasp. She did not look shocked. She simply sighed, long and tired, as if I had confirmed what she had feared all along. "I'm not supposed to gossip," she whispered, leaning close. "But Marcus has always carried shadows with him. Folks talk. You hear things if you pay attention. You are not the first girl he's charmed with big promises. And unless he's changed, you won't be the last." Her words landed heavy, but they steadied me too. This wasn't just paranoia. This was a pattern. Later, I walked to the corner store where Marcus often bought beer late at night. The clerk, an older man with kind eyes, recognized me immediately. "Soon to be Mrs. Marcus," he greeted cheerfully. I forced a smile, then gently asked if Marcus came by often. The man chuckled. "He comes around plenty, sometimes with company." My stomach tightened. I asked what kind of company. He shrugged, hesitant, then muttered, "Not the kind you bring home to your mama." By the time I stepped back into the sunlight, my legs felt like stone. The truth wasn't hiding anymore. It was standing tall, staring me in the face. Every whisper, every warning, every uneasy instinct, they had all been right. When I returned home, Mama was humming as she arranged flowers. Her joy was a knife twisting inside me. I wanted to run to her, to cry in her lap like I was still her little girl, but I couldn't bring myself to crush her happiness just yet. Instead, I slipped upstairs, closed my door, and called Tanisha. My voice cracked as I told her what I had learned from Sister Janine and the clerk. She cursed under her breath, then steadied me with words like iron. "That's it, girl. That's confirmation. You ain't crazy. You ain't paranoid. He is dirty. Now you decide, will you expose him or let him cage you?" Her challenge echoed in me long after the call ended. I sat by the window, the veil box glowing in the fading light, and felt my spine straighten. The evidence was no longer just mine. It was echoed by others, spoken aloud, undeniable. That night, Marcus strutted through the door, whistling like always, tossing his keys in the bowl as if he carried no secrets. He kissed my cheek, asked about dinner, pretended to be the man everyone adored. But I no longer looked at him with doubt. I looked at him with certainty. He was guilty, and I held the proof like fire in my hands. Listener, by then I knew the wedding was no longer a celebration, it was a stage. And when the curtain rose, I would not be playing the part he had written for me. The days marched closer to the wedding, and the silence between Marcus and me grew thick enough to choke on. To anyone watching, we looked steady, smiling in photographs, practicing vows, holding hands at the rehearsal like we had no weight on us. But inside, every touch burned like ice. I carried the truth in my chest like a locked box, and each time he leaned close, the key turned sharper. At the rehearsal dinner, laughter bounced off the church basement walls. Plates of fried chicken and macaroni made the table sag. Aunties bragged about their potato salad. Uncles told stories too loud. Cousins snapped pictures. Marcus thrived in the spotlight, joking, pouring drinks, kissing my cheek every chance he got. Each kiss was a performance, rehearsed for the audience. I let him play his part, nodding, smiling, even laughing on cue. But in my heart I whispered, "Your stage is crumbling." When the dinner ended and families drifted home, I walked back into the sanctuary alone. The pews were empty, candles unlit, air cool. I slid into the front row and stared at the altar, the very spot where I was supposed to promise forever. My palms dampened as I imagined saying I do with lies hanging above me like cobwebs. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and whispered, "Lord, what do I do?" The silence answered louder than any voice. "You already know the truth." That night, Marcus crawled into bed beside me, whispering that he loved me, that he couldn't wait for our future. His arm draped heavy across me. I lay stiff, staring at the ceiling. Every breath he took sounded like a thief counting coins. I wanted to roll over and confront him, but fear pinned me. What if he denied everything? What if he turned it all on me? So I said nothing. Silence became my shield. But silence has a sound all its own. It grows louder than shouting, heavier than argument. The next morning, over breakfast, Mama commented on the quiet. "Y'all nervous?" she teased, but her eyes lingered on me. I forced a laugh, told her I was just tired. She bought the excuse, or maybe she wanted to. Throughout the day, I watched Marcus with sharper eyes. Every detail stuck out. The way he smiled at texts he wouldn't show me, the way he dodged questions about where he'd been, the way his hands fidgeted when he thought nobody saw. The silence between us filled with evidence, thick and undeniable. By evening, I sat at my desk, pulling out the journal again. Page after page, I wrote. The photo, the notebook, the hotel, the whispers from Sister Janine, the words from the store clerk, the embrace I had seen with my own eyes. Then, at the bottom of the page, I wrote in big, shaking letters, "I cannot marry this man." I stared at the words until my heartbeat slowed. I folded the page, tucked it into the envelope already in my purse, and whispered to myself, "This will be my shield. This will be my sword." The house was alive with preparations, Mama humming, bridesmaids ironing dresses, cousins running errands. But inside me, a storm brewed in silence. Not the silence of fear anymore, but of power gathering itself. And listener, if you've ever sat in that quiet before a storm breaks, you know the air itself begins to buzz. That was me, sitting in silence, waiting, bracing, sharpening. The storm was coming, and when it hit, the whole church would hear it. The night before the wedding pressed down on me like a weighted blanket I couldn't kick off. Every sound in the house, Mama humming in the kitchen, cousins giggling in the hallway, bridesmaids whispering over nail polish, felt far away, muffled, like I was underwater. Everyone else floated on joy, but I was drowning in questions. I sat by the window, veil box on my lap, moonlight brushing the edges. I lifted the fabric and let it spill across my fingers. It shimmered soft and pure, mocking me with its innocence. "How can I wear you?" I whispered, when my heart already knows the vows would be lies. My voice cracked, but no one heard. I pressed the veil against my chest, feeling both comforted and betrayed by its beauty. Marcus had texted earlier, "Love you, can't wait for tomorrow." 3 simple words, typed without effort. I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. Did he send the same words to her? Did he whisper them into another woman's ear while holding her in his arms? My stomach knotted, rage boiling with sorrow. Part of me wanted to cancel everything right then. Call the florist, the church, the guests. Tell Mama the truth and let the pieces fall where they may. But another part, the part trained since childhood to keep peace, to smile, to avoid shame, told me to wait, to swallow the fire until the ceremony. I wrestled between those 2 voices, one screaming for freedom, the other pleading for quiet. Around midnight, Tanisha knocked on my door. She didn't wait for permission, just walked in, eyes sharp and tender. "Girl, you look like you're carrying bricks on your back," she said. I broke then, tears spilling before I could stop them. I told her again about the photo, the notebook, the hotel, the whispers, the woman. She listened, nodding slowly, jaw tight. When I finished, she took my hands. "You have to decide. Tomorrow it's either you or him. Don't let it be him." Her words cut through me like light slicing a storm. She kissed my forehead, whispered, "I got your back," and slipped out. I sat there shaking, but her voice echoed until it steadied me. "It's either you or him." I turned to the mirror, eyes red, face pale. For the first time, I saw more than a bride. I saw a woman on the edge of reclaiming her own name. Fear still crawled in me, but courage was rising too, louder than fear, steadier than doubt. The hours crawled. I lay in bed, but never slept. My mind played reels of possibilities. Me walking down the aisle and saying nothing, my life chained to lies. Me standing tall, speaking truth, shattering the silence. In one vision, I was small and broken. In the other, I was fierce and free. By dawn, my choice wasn't polished, but it was solid. I would not whisper. I would not bow. If Marcus thought he could trap me with ceremony and vows, he had misjudged the woman he was marrying. The church would not be his stage, it would be mine. Listener, that final night was my battlefield. I fought fear, shame, doubt, and expectation. And when the sun rose, I walked out of that war scarred but standing. Tomorrow I would carry the storm in my chest, and I would let it roar. The morning of my wedding rose pale and slow, as if even the sun hesitated to look me in the eye. The house, however, pulsed with energy. Mama's voice floated through the hall, sharp with excitement as she gave orders. Bridesmaids scurried, curling irons hissed, perfume clouds drifted like prayers. Everyone believed this day was holy, everyone but me. I sat before the mirror, veil spread across my lap, hands trembling as I traced the edge of satin. My reflection looked like a stranger, eyes swollen from a night without sleep, mouth pressed thin, face pale. This was supposed to be the happiest morning of my life, yet all I felt was the thrum of dread under my ribs. The weight of my decision pressed heavy. I had 2 paths, step into silence and bind myself to lies, or stand tall and drag the truth into the light. Both roads promised pain. One promised chains, the other promised freedom, but freedom born in fire. Marcus arrived mid-morning, sharp in his suit, grinning like a man untouched by shadows. He brought flowers, roses, red as blood, and placed them in Mama's hands. She beamed, praising him as the best man alive. I smiled faintly, but inside, bile rose. I could see the notebook in my memory, the hotel room, the woman's arms, the whispers from neighbors and friends. Every lie had gathered into a storm cloud above my head. Tanisha slipped into my room as I adjusted my veil. She closed the door, leaned against it, and whispered, "It's today, girl. You ready?" I swallowed, throat dry, but I nodded. She searched my eyes, then squeezed my hand. "Don't let him steal your voice. Whatever you choose, make sure it's yours." Her words wrapped around me like armor. When the time came, the bridal car waited. I stepped inside, veil trembling with each breath I took. As the church steeple came into view, my chest tightened, but beneath the fear was something fiercer: resolve. The sanctuary wasn't just a place of vows, it was a stage, and I had chosen my role. Inside, music swelled. Guests turned, faces bright with joy. Mama's eyes brimmed with tears as she walked me down the aisle, her hand firm in mine. I smiled for her, but my heart whispered, "Hold steady." Each step echoed with the decision I had made hours before. I would not marry a man of lies. When we reached the altar, Marcus took my hand. His grip was warm, steady, convincing. To everyone else, we looked like love itself. To me, his touch felt foreign, borrowed. The pastor's voice rang out, calling for silence, preparing for vows. My pulse thundered in my ears. In that stillness, I drew a breath deeper than any I had ever taken. Fear clawed at my throat, but I pushed it aside. I thought of the photograph, the notebook, the woman, the witnesses who had confirmed my doubts. I thought of Tanisha's voice, it's either you or him. And finally, I thought of myself, the woman who deserved more than scraps of honesty. The decision crystallized in my chest. I would not let this day bury me alive. I would let it set me free. And listener, as I stood at that altar, veil trembling, hands steady, I felt the storm gather. The church didn't know it yet, but the truth was about to speak louder than the vows. The church bells tolled noon, deep and steady, like a drumbeat counting down to something no one else could see. Guests shuffled into pews dressed in their Sunday best. Colors bright as spring gardens, smiles wide, voices warm. The air smelled of roses, candle wax, and expectation. Every step I took down that aisle was measured. My heart beat loud enough I swore the organist could hear it over the music. Mama squeezed my arm tight, whispering, "Baby, you look like a dream." I smiled for her sake, but inside my chest the storm pressed harder, lightning sparking in silence. Tanisha caught my eye from the second row. She didn't smile. She just nodded once, slow and sure. That nod steadied me more than any hymn ever could. Marcus stood waiting at the altar, sharp in his tux, his grin flashing like polished steel. To the guests, he was the picture of devotion. To me, he was a mask stretched too tight. His eyes searched mine as I reached him, and for a split second, I thought I saw fear flicker there. The pastor welcomed everyone, voice booming with joy. He spoke about love, about covenant, about two souls joining as one. Each word echoed heavy, pressing on me like a weight I could not carry. I glanced around. Rows of family, neighbors, church folk leaning forward, eyes bright, waiting for a show of love. They didn't know they were about to witness something else. As the scripture was read, Marcus squeezed my hand. His touch was firm, possessive, a signal meant to bind me. I let him hold on, but inside I whispered, "Not today." My other hand clutched the envelope hidden in my bouquet, the one carrying my notes, my proof, my shield. Its weight reminded me that I wasn't walking blind. I had evidence. The choir hummed softly behind us, voices rising like wings. I stared at the stained glass above the altar. Mary in blue, Christ in gold. Light spilled through, painting the floor in colors that looked too holy for lies. My chest tightened. I felt my pulse in my throat, in my wrists, in my temples. This was the edge. This was the cliff. And I had already chosen to jump. The pastor turned toward Marcus first. His words rang out. "Do you, Marcus, take this woman?" Marcus answered quickly, smooth as silk. "I do." Applause rippled softly. My stomach twisted. He spoke vows as if they were lines rehearsed in secret, knowing full well he had no intention of keeping them. Then the pastor turned to me. The sanctuary stilled. Even the air seemed to pause. My hands trembled. But I lifted my chin, my lips parted, breath shaking. I could feel hundreds of eyes pressing on me, waiting for my "I do." Mama's face glowed with tears. Marcus's smile was wide, demanding, daring me to play my part. But beneath the silence, my heart thundered with the decision I had made. I would not bow to the script he had written. I would not chain myself with vows forged in lies. I looked at Marcus, really looked, his jaw tight, his grin brittle, his eyes sharp with control, and in that moment, clarity struck like lightning. I knew what had to come next. Listener, the ceremony had only just begun, but so had my storm. The church leaned forward, hungry for the sound of love. Instead, they would soon hear the sound of truth breaking open. The pastor's voice rang out calm and steady. "Do you, child of God, take this man, to have and to hold?" His words swirled in the air, heavy as smoke, pressing on my chest. Every guest leaned in, ready to hear my answer. I could feel Mama's eyes burning into me, her tears of joy already spilling. Marcus's hand gripped mine tighter, his palm slick with nerves he tried to hide. I opened my mouth. The words "I do" hovered on the edge of my lips, but they would not come. My throat tightened, my body stiffened. Instead, I heard my own voice, soft at first, trembling, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Stop. The sanctuary froze. The organist's fingers slipped, producing a single wrong note. That echoed like a scream. Murmurs spread through the pews. The pastor blinked, confused. Marcus's smile cracked for the first time. The mask slipping just a fraction. I can't, I said louder, my voice steadier this time. I cannot stand here and pretend. When I know the truth. Gasps rippled. Someone dropped a hymnal. The air turned electric, as if the stained glass windows themselves were listening. Marcus leaned closer, his voice low and harsh, meant only for me. What are you doing? Don't embarrass me. His grip on my hand tightened painfully. I yanked free, holding my bouquet close, the envelope inside pressing firm against my palm. Courage rushed through me like fire in my veins. I will not marry a lie, I declared, my voice echoing through the sanctuary. This man you all think you know has betrayed me. He has betrayed all of us. The congregation erupted, some gasping, some whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Mama stood from the front row, her face pale, tears sliding down her cheeks. Baby, please, she whispered. My heart broke for her, but I couldn't stop now. This was bigger than shame or tradition. This was survival. Marcus tried to laugh it off, spreading his arms. She's nervous, he said to the crowd, voice slick, eyes desperate. Cold feet, that's all, but his words wobbled, brittle as glass. The guests could hear the tremor in his tone. No, I said firmly. Not cold feet, cold truth. With shaking hands, I reached into my bouquet and pulled out the envelope. I held it high. Here's the proof, photographs, notes, witnesses, evidence that this man has been lying to me. Lying to you all, lying to God. The church erupted again, louder this time. Murmurs turned into shouts. Lord have mercy, an auntie cried. Someone else demanded, Is this true, Marcus? The pastor raised his hands, calling for order. But order had fled. Marcus's face twisted, his grin gone, replaced by fury. He stepped toward me, voice low and dangerous. You don't know what you're doing. But I stood tall, lifting my chin. Yes, I do. I am saving myself. For a heartbeat, the sanctuary held its breath. The storm had broken, and nothing would return to silence. Listener, that was the moment I shattered the script. The instant I chose my own voice over his lies. The vows were interrupted. Yes, but so was the chain he thought would bind me, and the church would never forget what happened next. The sanctuary was no longer a place of quiet reverence. It had turned into a courtroom, and I was standing at the center, holding evidence like a weapon. Gasps swelled through the pews, whispers clattered like stones, and the choir members shifted uneasily, their robes rustling as if the spirit itself had moved among them. I stood tall, bouquet trembling in my hands, envelope clutched like scripture. Marcus's face darkened. He reached for me, whispering through clenched teeth, Put it away. Smile, say yes, and we can fix this later. His voice cracked, fear sliding beneath the anger. I pulled the photographs from the envelope, holding them high for all to see. This is who he really is, I said, my voice breaking at first, then rising strong. Not the man of honor, you think? Not the faithful husband he promised to be. This is Marcus, standing in another woman's arms, smiling in another woman's eyes. A wave of sound crashed over the congregation. Some gasped, some shouted, others clutched their pearls or shook their heads. Mama covered her mouth, her tears flowing freely. The pastor's Bible slipped slightly in his hands as he stepped forward, his face etched with disbelief. Marcus lunged towards me, but Tanisha moved from her pew, fierce as fire, blocking him. Don't you dare touch her, she snapped, voice sharp enough to silence half the room. Gasps followed her bravery, and suddenly I wasn't alone. The congregation's eyes weren't just on me, they were on him, on the man unraveling at the altar. He tried to laugh, a sound hollow and desperate. These are fake, she's making this up, she's hysterical. But even as he spoke, his eyes darted, his hands shook, and the truth bled through every false word. The more he denied, the clearer his guilt became. Then came the murmurs, voices rising from the pews, from people who had known him since boyhood. I saw him with her last month, someone whispered loudly enough to carry. Didn't he used to sneak out with? Another added. The whispers grew into a chorus, each voice another nail in his coffin. I lifted my chin, my tears no longer a mark of weakness, but of release. You cannot hide anymore, I said, my voice echoing. Not from me, not from them, not from God. I will not marry a liar. I will not chain myself to betrayal. The pastor raised his hands, but the church was already in chaos. Some guests shouted, "Amen." Others begged for calm. Mama stood frozen, her hand clutching her chest, torn between sorrow and pride. And me? I felt lighter than I had in months. Marcus's mask shattered completely. He shouted, cursed, tried to storm down the aisle. Ushers stepped forward, blocking his path, guiding him out as the congregation erupted in noise. He struggled, but the more he fought, the smaller he seemed, his power slipping away with each step. I stood alone at the altar, veil trembling, bouquet half crushed in my hands. Silence rippled slowly back into the room as the doors slammed behind him. I breathed deep, steady, my voice shaking yet sure. I came here today to marry, but instead, I chose myself. Applause broke out, not from everyone, but from enough. Some clapped timidly, others shouted, "That's right," and "Speak the truth, sister." Tanisha's voice rose above them all. "That's how you do it." And listener, in that holy space, I learned the power of my own voice. The truth, once hidden, was now unleashed, roaring louder than lies. The wedding had ended, but my freedom had just begun. The slam of the sanctuary doors echoed like thunder. For a moment, no one breathed. A groom was dragged out by ushers. I stood at the center, veil trembling, bouquet crushed in my hands, heart racing with equal parts fear and freedom. Then the noise began again, louder this time. An avalanche of voices. Aunties fanned themselves, muttering, "Lord have mercy." Uncles argued, cousins whispered furiously. Every pew buzzed like a hive struck with a stick. Mama moved first. She stumbled toward me, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Baby," she whispered, her voice a mixture of heartbreak and awe. She touched my face, trembling fingers brushing away a tear. "You did what you had to do." Her words cracked, but there was pride in them too, beneath the sorrow of a dream dissolved. The pastor cleared his throat, trying to gather order. "Brothers and sisters, let us remember this is the house of God." But his words drowned beneath the commotion. The choir shuffled nervously, robes swaying, eyes darting between me and the empty door. Some sang softly under their breath. Hymns cracked with unease, trying to patch the silence with fragments of praise. Tanisha stepped forward, steady as a pillar. She wrapped her arm around my shoulders and faced the congregation like a shield. "She spoke truth," she declared, voice bold. "She saved herself. Don't you dare shame her for that." Her words sliced through the noise, silencing some, emboldening others. Applause rippled again, stronger, a wave of approval. But not everyone clapped. A few older deacons shook their heads, muttering about embarrassment and timing. One guest hissed, "She could have handled this differently." Their disapproval pressed on me like cold fingers. But I held my chin high. I had not come to please them. I had come to free myself. The photographer lowered his camera, unsure whether to keep shooting. The wedding planner stood pale, clutching her clipboard. And Mama, still at my side, finally straightened, her voice clear. "The wedding is over. My daughter chose truth. That is enough." The sanctuary stilled. People shifted, coughed, whispered, but no one challenged her. Slowly, guests began to file out, their footsteps echoing against the tile. Programs crumpled on pews, flowers drooped, candles flickered uncertainly. The grand celebration dissolved into fragments, like confetti swept away by rain. I stood watching it all, veil sliding down my shoulders. My hands shook, but my spirit felt steadier than ever. The collapse was not destruction, it was release. The marriage had crumbled before it began, though ruins lay scattered. I walked out of them lighter. When I finally stepped down from the altar, Tanisha at one side and Mama at the other. The church doors opened wide, sunlight spilled in, bright and unashamed. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with air free of lies. And listener, that was the moment I understood. Sometimes the collapse of a wedding is not tragedy, but salvation. What others saw as shame, I felt as deliverance. The walls of that church had shaken, but my voice had stood firm. And though the ceremony had ended in chaos, my life was beginning anew. On truth, not deception. The church doors creaked open as I stepped forward, my veil slipping off my shoulders, train dragging behind me like the skin of a snake I had finally shed. Sunlight spilled through the doorway, golden and fierce, washing over me as though heaven itself had decided to cleanse what the ceremony could not. For the first time in months, I could breathe without tasting iron. The congregation hovered in the background, some still murmuring, some staring wide-eyed, some lifting their phones as if they needed proof that the drama they'd witnessed was real. I ignored them all. My focus was on the bright world outside, the street lined with cars, the breeze fluttering the trees. I walked as if each step erased a chain I hadn't realized I was dragging. Mama followed close behind, her hand trembling on my arm. I could feel the storm of her emotions, shame, sorrow, pride, relief, all colliding at once. "You're strong, baby," she whispered, voice breaking. "Stronger than I ever was." Her tears glistened in the sun, and I leaned against her for a moment, drawing strength from her trembling pride. Tanisha strode beside me, chin high, daring anyone to challenge what I had done. "Look at you," she said softly, almost smiling, "walking taller than I've ever seen." She brushed a stray curl from my face, her eyes fierce and tender at once. "You saved yourself." Those words wrapped around me like armor, steadier than the veil now trailing limp in my hand. Outside, whispers followed me like shadows. Some people averted their eyes, embarrassed by the spectacle. Others nodded with respect, even clapped quietly, as though honoring a sermon they hadn't expected to hear. A few muttered judgments under their breath, but their voices no longer mattered. The shame they wanted me to wear slipped off me like water. Each step down those stone steps was a declaration. I would not be defined by betrayal. I would not be remembered as the bride abandoned at the altar. I would be remembered as the woman who chose truth over comfort, freedom over illusion. My heels clicked steady on the pavement, a rhythm that matched the new beat of my heart. The limousine meant to carry us away stood waiting, ribbon still tied to its hood. I laughed bitterly and shook my head. "Not today," I whispered. Instead, I walked past it, toward the open street. Every car honk, every bird cry, every rustle of leaves felt like applause. The city itself seemed to nod in approval. Mama caught up, breathless, clutching her purse. "Where will you go?" she asked, worry and hope wrestling in her eyes. I kissed her cheek gently. "Anywhere but backward." The words surprised even me, but they rang true. Forward was enough for now. Tanisha slipped her arm through mine. "Then forward we go," she said, guiding me toward her car parked at the curb. We passed neighbors, strangers, children staring with wide eyes. None of it broke my stride. For once, I was not shrinking. I was expanding, filling the space I had always deserved. When I slid into Tanisha's car, the seat felt like a throne. I pulled the veil from my head, tossed it into the back seat, and let out a laugh that turned into a sob. Mama pressed a handkerchief into my palm. I wiped my face, then leaned back, the weight gone. The truth was heavy, yes, but freedom was light. Listener, that walk out of the church was not a walk of shame. It was a march of triumph, a procession of survival. The world had seen my collapse, but they would also see my rise. I had chosen myself, and that choice echoed louder than any vow ever could. The ride away from the church was quiet at first, the hum of Tanisha's car the only sound cutting through the silence. I leaned my head against the window, watching the world blur by, the sunlight streaking across rooftops and trees like brushstrokes. My chest still heaved, but not with fear. This time it was relief, thick and unsteady but real. The veil lay crumpled in the back seat, no longer a crown but a relic, proof of a battle fought and won. Mama sat beside me, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Her silence carried more weight than any sermon I had ever heard. Finally, she reached for my hand, her fingers trembling but strong. "You're brave," she whispered. "I don't know if I could have done what you did, but I'm glad you did it, baby." Her words cracked open something inside me, and I squeezed her hand as tears rolled freely down my cheeks. Tanisha drove with her jaw tight, her eyes sharp on the road. She didn't speak until we reached a red light. Then she turned, her voice steady as steel. "You didn't just save yourself today. You showed every woman in that church that silence ain't survival. You taught them that truth, even when it burns, is the only way to be free." I swallowed hard, letting her words settle. She was right. What I had done wasn't just about Marcus. It was about me, yes, but it was also about every woman who had ever been told to swallow her doubts, to ignore the signs, to smile through betrayal. When we reached my house, neighbors peeked from porches, whispers floating in the air. I stepped out of the car with my head high, shoulders squared. Let them talk, let them spin stories. I knew my truth, and I would not shrink beneath their gaze. Inside, the house felt different, emptier without the decorations, quieter without the hum of preparations. But it also felt lighter, like the walls had exhaled the lies I refused to carry anymore. I walked to my room, placed the crushed bouquet on the dresser, and opened my journal. On a fresh page, I wrote in bold, heavy strokes, "I chose myself." For the first time, the words didn't feel like rebellion. They felt like salvation. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of the church. I imagined the stained glass glowing in the dark, whispering stories of truth louder than the vows never spoken. I imagined the murmurs of the congregation, some filled with judgment, others with awe. And I prayed that at least one person sitting in those pews had carried home a new kind of courage. Because that was the lesson, listener, the one I want you to remember. Love is not blind obedience. Love is not swallowing red flags and painting over lies. Love is truth, respect, loyalty. And if someone cannot give you those things, then leaving is not weakness. It is strength. It is survival. So if you ever find yourself where I stood, heart trembling, doubt screaming, the world expecting your silence, remember this: you have a choice. You can let lies bind you, or you can open your mouth and let the truth roar. It will hurt, it will shake walls, it might even collapse the life you thought you wanted, but it will also set you free. And listener, if my story touched you, if you believe in the power of truth spoken out loud, don't just hold it quietly. Share it, stand tall in your own life. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, filled with pain, strength, and hope, subscribe, follow, and keep listening. Because every time we tell the truth, we remind the world that silence is not survival.